It begins not with a battle, but with a letter. In the tense twilight of 1938, as Europe teetered between diplomacy and destruction, Benito Mussolini was at his desk in the Palazzo Venezia, his pen gliding across ivory paper embossed with the fascist emblem. To the outside world, he was the iron-fisted Duce, commanding a nation through spectacle and propaganda. But to those closest to him, he was a man of contradictions, insecure, calculating, and deeply dependent on the admiration of those within his inner circle. What few realized then was that Mussolini's private letters, often written in his own hand, would become a quiet obsession for British intelligence. The story begins in London, in the dim offices of Section D, a covert unit within the secret intelligence service that would soon evolve into the Special Operations Executive. Reports had reached the British Foreign Office that Mussolini's correspondences were being transmitted in coded form through diplomatic channels, masked as routine government communication. Among the recipients were figures like Count Galeazzo Ciano, his ambitious son-in-law and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the cautious strategist, and a young woman whose name had not yet reached Allied files, Clara Petacci. By late 1939, as Hitler's armies advanced into Poland, these letters began to draw attention not for their political content, but for their tone. The phrasing was intimate, at times romantic, laden with personal assurances and emotional appeals. Analysts inside Bletchley Park, working alongside the British code-breaking teams of Hut 3, noticed a pattern. Words of affection embedded between lines of strategy. One message read, "The heart must command where reason falters," transmitted just days before Mussolini's meeting with Hitler at the Brenner Pass. For the analysts, this was more than curiosity, it was intelligence gold. Personal letters could reveal motivations, weaknesses, even betrayals. To the intelligence community, the man behind the uniform was as critical to understanding Italy's position as its army divisions or oil reserves. "We are not reading the dictator," one SIS officer wrote in a confidential memo. "We are reading the man, and therein lies the key to his next move." But pursuing such intelligence was fraught with risk. Italy was still technically non-belligerent, balancing between Axis promises and Allied pressure. To be caught intercepting Mussolini's communications would have been a diplomatic scandal. So MI6 turned to neutral ground, Switzerland, where sympathetic couriers, telegraph operators, and Italian expatriates could quietly pass information to British agents operating under cover of the British legation in Bern. There, files marked Italian Confidential V Priority began to accumulate in locked cabinets, slowly forming a portrait of the Duce's private world. What emerged disturbed the analysts. Mussolini's letters reflected a man torn between vanity and fear, driven as much by emotion as ideology. He wrote frequently of loyalty and betrayal, of the need to preserve devotion among those whose eyes do not blink before power. Some in British intelligence began to theorize that his closest advisors were manipulating his emotional attachments to influence key political decisions, especially those aligning Italy closer to Germany. These were not the words of a leader in full control, but of a man ruled by the intimate power of those who surrounded him. Within Italy, that inner circle grew increasingly fractured. Ciano, who admired Mussolini yet secretly distrusted Hitler, kept his own diary, a record that would one day expose the regime's contradictions. Badoglio, though outwardly loyal, harbored doubts about Italy's military readiness. And in the background, Clara Petacci, nearly 30 years Mussolini's junior, became his most devoted confidant. Her letters to him, preserved in fragments, reveal a relationship both tender and perilous, one that blurred the boundaries between affection and manipulation. As 1940 approached, Allied analysts noticed that the tone of the letters shifted. Mussolini's words hardened. His sentimentality was replaced with defiance. "The time has come," one message declared, for Italy to claim its destiny beside Germany. Historians later debated whether this conviction was born of ideology or of the pressure from those who had mastered the language of his heart. The letters became not just historical curiosities, but artifacts of psychological warfare, influencing decisions that would send hundreds of thousands into battle. In early 1940, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, received a summary from British intelligence. Italian communications suggest Juice's resolve is emotionally reinforced, not strategically rational. Recommend continued observation. The recommendation would lead directly to one of the war's most obscure intelligence efforts, Operation Glass Ink, a mission to retrieve the full content of Mussolini's secret correspondences. But before the operation began, one question haunted those who had read the intercepted messages. Were these merely love letters, or coded confessions of political manipulation hidden in plain sight? The answer lay somewhere between passion and power, a truth concealed within ink and paper. As Europe descended into war, British intelligence prepared to uncover what lay behind the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle. By the spring of 1940, the shadow of war had fallen across Europe. Norway and Denmark had been occupied, France was faltering, and the Mediterranean, once a sea of commerce, was now a theatre of espionage. Amid this chaos, a single coded message intercepted by the British listening station at Scarborough sparked the beginning of one of the most obscure intelligence missions of World War II, Operation Glass Ink. The message was brief, cryptic, and transmitted from Rome to the Italian legation in Bern. The letters are to be secured in the black case. Trust no one but him. To most analysts, it might have meant nothing, but to the small circle of officers working under the Secret Intelligence Service's Section D, it was confirmation that Mussolini's private correspondence, his most personal and politically sensitive writings, was being moved across borders. The letters were believed to contain evidence of internal divisions among Italy's leadership, possibly revealing secret channels between fascist officials and the Vatican, or even British contacts, seeking to delay Italy's entry into the war. The mission fell to the newly formed Special Operations Executive, a covert branch tasked by Churchill to set Europe ablaze. Its agents would operate under diplomatic cover, gathering intelligence and intercepting communications from neutral Switzerland. At its head in Bern was Major Ronald Thornley, a linguist and veteran of the British legation. He coordinated a network of Italian refugees, sympathizers, and code specialists who worked behind closed curtains and false shopfronts in Geneva and Lugano. The operation's name, Glass Ink, was chosen for its symbolism, invisible yet indelible, the kind of mark that could only be seen when held to the light. Their task was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. Intercept Mussolini's personal correspondence as it passed through neutral territory and decode what the Italians were so desperate to conceal. In the spring of 1940, British cryptanalysts from Bletchley Park began receiving packets of telegram intercepts sent via Bern. Within the elegant flourishes of Mussolini's words were hidden ciphers, references to the circle, the promise, and devotion to the cause. One line, decoded after weeks of analysis, read, "Those who love, truly, will serve without question." Another mentioned, "The one who must not be named, but who holds my heart." To the intelligence officers, these lines hinted not only at romantic infatuation, but perhaps coded directives intended for high-ranking officials or operatives loyal to Mussolini alone. Major Thornley, in his dispatches to London, described the growing sense of duality surrounding the letters. "It is unclear," he wrote in June 1940, "whether we are reading the words of a man in love or the directives of a leader concealing orders in the language of affection." The ambiguity itself became a weapon, a veil under which Mussolini could communicate with allies and lovers alike, beyond the scrutiny of official channels. Meanwhile, across the Italian peninsula, preparations for war were accelerating. On June 10th, Mussolini declared Italy's entry into World War II, standing on the Palazzo Venezia balcony as crowds roared beneath him. Yet intelligence suggested that the decision had not been purely strategic. In one intercepted letter, written days before the declaration, he confided to a member of his inner circle, "To hesitate now is to betray those who believe in me." And her, most of all, would never forgive hesitation. Who her referred to remained a question that British intelligence could not conclusively answer, though many suspected Clara Petacci, his devoted companion. Operation Glass Ink intensified in the weeks that followed. British agents working through the neutral press began publishing subtle misinformation, hoping to provoke Italian responses that might reveal more about the mysterious letters. Cryptanalysts in London were racing against time, their efforts complicated by Mussolini's frequent use of idioms, personal metaphors, and hand-modified ciphers. Every decoded phrase was examined by both linguists and psychologists. A collaboration unprecedented in the intelligence world. The aim was not just to break a code, but to understand the man behind it. By late 1940, a breakthrough arrived from a surprising source. An Italian telegraph operator in Geneva, secretly aligned with the British, smuggled out a carbon copy of one of Mussolini's personal telegrams. It was addressed to GC, assumed to be Count Ciano, and referred to "Our confidence is sealed by her ink and my blood." To the analysts, it was both poetic and chilling. Were these simply love letters, or were they an encrypted record of secret political transactions, hidden within the veneer of affection? But the deeper the British dug, the more dangerous the mission became. Italian counterintelligence had begun to suspect leaks in Bern, and several of Thornley's informants disappeared without trace. In December 1940, one courier, an Italian journalist named Arturo Caprari, was found dead near the Swiss border, his satchel missing. Within weeks, communication between Rome and Bern went dark. Operation Glass Ink had to be suspended. Still, the fragments they gathered painted an unsettling picture of Mussolini's emotional vulnerability, and of those around him who understood how to exploit it. The correspondence suggested a man increasingly trapped between love, loyalty, and paranoia, a ruler whose private passions were being played against him by those closest to his throne. As 1941 dawned and Italy's armies faced defeat in Greece and North Africa, the British analysts who had studied Mussolini's words began to suspect that the key to understanding his wartime behavior lay not in his speeches or orders, but in the unseen influence of the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle. In early 1941, as the war spilled deeper into North Africa, British intelligence received its most promising lead yet. A captured Italian officer, Lieutenant Vittorio Montesi of the 10th Army, claimed under interrogation that the Duce's private letters were being guarded in a vault beneath the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, and that within those papers lay secrets that could undo more than reputations. For Major Evelyn, Cross of the British Intelligence Corps, it was the opening she had been waiting for. Cross, a Cambridge historian turned intelligence officer, had been recruited by the Special Operations Executive after her work decoding Italian military signals. Sharp, meticulous, and fluent in Italian, she was assigned to a reconnaissance mission operating from Allied-occupied Cairo. Her directive was clear but nearly impossible: confirm the existence of Mussolini's hidden archive and, if possible, secure copies of his correspondence before it could be destroyed or captured by the Germans. The mission was rooted in both strategy and psychology. Intelligence analysts believed that understanding Mussolini's emotional dependencies could give the Allies a rare insight into his military decisions. Italy's campaigns in Greece and North Africa had already shown signs of poor coordination and wavering confidence, traits, some suggested, linked directly to Mussolini's mercurial moods. If those letters revealed who influenced him most, the Allies could exploit those personal ties through propaganda or negotiation. From Cairo, Cross worked with a small intelligence cell under Brigadier Dudley Clark's Deception Unit, a force, the same group that masterminded psychological operations across the Mediterranean. Posing as a Red Cross attaché, she established contacts among Italian prisoners of war held in Alexandria and Tobruk, trading cigarettes for gossip and snippets of rumor. It was during one such exchange that a captured Italian radio operator mentioned the Countess's letters, correspondence that Mussolini was said to read in private, sometimes in tears, sometimes in fury. "They say he keeps them in a black case," the soldier told her, echoing the earlier intercepted message from Operation Glass Ink. No one else touches them. The trail led Cross to neutral territory once again. Switzerland. There, a network of Italian exiles operated under British supervision, smuggling information through diplomatic couriers and Vatican intermediaries. Cross travelled to Bern in May 1941 under the alias Evelyn Hall, armed with forged credentials and a dossier marked simply C5. Her orders came directly from London: gather intelligence on the whereabouts of the letters rumoured to link Mussolini to both his mistress, Clara Petacci, and to members of his fascist Grand Council who were allegedly plotting behind his back. Her contact in Bern was Carlo Martelli, a disillusioned Italian diplomat who had fled Rome after falling out with Ciano. Over brandy and whispered conversation in the back room of the Café du Théâtre, Martelli told her of a hidden archive, a chamber beneath the Palazzo Venezia where Mussolini kept sensitive documents, personal diaries, photographs, and letters bound in red ribbon. "They are his true weakness," Martelli said. "He trusts paper more than people." The operation to verify the archive's existence took months, cross-coordinated with local agents to monitor Italian couriers traveling between Rome and the Vatican. Several of these messengers carried sealed packets marked Riservatissimo, the highest level of fascist secrecy. One packet, intercepted and photographed by British operatives, contained an inventory of personal correspondences 1937 to present. That was the confirmation London needed. By the summer of 1941, the situation in North Africa grew desperate for the Italians. Field Marshal Graziani's army had collapsed, forcing Hitler to send Rommel's Africa Corps to stabilize the front. As the British advanced toward Tobruk, Cross's intelligence unit reported that Mussolini was blaming his generals and confiding his anger through personal letters rather than official channels. One intercepted message to Ciano read, "There are men who wear my uniform but not my faith. They will pay for their weakness." Analysts believed these letters were not just emotional venting. They were signals of internal purges and policy shifts within the fascist regime. In late 1941, Cross's field network made a bold attempt to obtain photographic proof of the archive. An Italian clerk named Lorenzo Bellini, sympathetic to the Allies, was persuaded to photograph documents within the Palazzo Venezia after hours. Only 2 images survived the mission. One of a desk drawer filled with sealed envelopes marked CP, and another of a handwritten note signed simply B. The note read, "If these words ever fall into enemy hands, they will see not the dictator, but the man they have never met." Then, Bellini disappeared. Italian security police raided his apartment days later, and within a week, Cross's Bern network went silent. Her diplomatic cover was nearly blown. She was exfiltrated back to Cairo under the guise of illness. Her final report to London described a disturbing possibility, that Mussolini's private letters were not only being guarded, but actively used as leverage within his own government. "The correspondences," she wrote, "may serve as chains of loyalty, or as blackmail binding the Duce to those who know his secrets." For British intelligence, it was a revelation. Mussolini's vulnerability was no longer theoretical. It was documented, photographed, and hidden somewhere within the heart of fascist Rome. The question now was not whether the letters existed, but whether they could be found before Italy itself collapsed under the weight of war. As 1942 dawned, and the tide began to turn against the Axis, MI6 began to fear that the truth within, the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle, might be lost forever, buried beneath the ruins of the regime they sought to understand. Rome, July 1943. The air was thick with heat and fear. Allied bombers had struck the capital. The fascist Grand Council had turned against its own leader. And Benito Mussolini, once the master of Italy, now found himself trapped inside a crumbling empire. Yet, amid the chaos of collapsing fronts and shifting loyalties, one quiet race was underway: to seize, destroy, or conceal the private letters that had bound Mussolini to his most trusted circle. British and Vatican diplomats had both learned of their existence, the so-called Black Case, rumoured to contain intimate correspondence between Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and several members of his fascist cabinet. Inside the Vatican, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish priest known for helping Allied prisoners escape, reported that envoys loyal to the Pope were negotiating discreetly with both the Germans and the British. Their goal: to secure documents that could later prove invaluable in post-war reconciliation efforts, or as leverage against whichever side emerged victorious. From the Allied perspective, Operation Glass Ink had evolved into a new phase: retrieval. British intelligence no longer sought merely to intercept Mussolini's letters, but to recover them physically before they disappeared. The mission was now supervised by a covert diplomatic cell operating out of Lisbon under the direction of Major Evelyn Cross, recalled from Cairo after her near exposure in Switzerland. Her new orders, sent under Churchill's signature, were concise: Locate and secure the correspondence before it falls into enemy or partisan hands. Preserve the record, not the man. In late July, Mussolini's government finally imploded. On the night of July 24, 25, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove him from power. King Victor Emmanuel III summoned him to Villa Savoia the next morning, informing him curtly that he was dismissed and would be taken into custody for his own safety. As Mussolini was escorted away, the Germans were caught off guard, and the regime that had ruled Italy for 2 decades crumbled overnight. Amid the confusion, several palace staff members, including clerks and secretaries, reportedly looted Mussolini's office. According to post-war testimonies, crates of documents, some marked Privato, Riservatissimo, were hurriedly removed from the Palazzo Venezia and transported to the German embassy on Via Tasso. Others vanished entirely. The most valuable of these, according to an Italian colonel later captured by the Allies, were the Duce's private letters to the Signora and to the Council. The Signora, of course, was Clara Petacci. From Lisbon, cross-coordinated with Allied liaisons in the Vatican, attempting to trace the missing documents. Vatican records from August 1943 mention a British request concerning personal papers belonging to a deposed head of state, but the files remain partially redacted to this day. Some within the Curia feared that the letters, if made public, could damage the Church's neutrality by exposing private negotiations between senior clerics and fascist officials. Others saw them as a safeguard against German retaliation, proof that the Vatican had never fully supported Mussolini's rule. Meanwhile, German intelligence was also hunting the letters. Hitler, furious at his allies' downfall, ordered the SS to locate and rescue Mussolini, and to retrieve any documents that could be used to discredit the new Italian government. On September 12, 1943, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny executed the daring Gran Sasso raid, freeing Mussolini from his mountaintop prison. While history records that he was flown to Hitler's headquarters in Rustenburg, few mention that among the baggage recovered from the site were several small leather cases, one reportedly marked with the initials BM. Whether that case contained the letters or merely his personal papers remains a mystery. For the British, this was a devastating turn. Operation Glassinck's intelligence trail went cold. Cross's liaison in Rome, an Italian priest who had been quietly photographing diplomatic correspondence, was found dead in an alley near the Piazza Navona. The Vatican abruptly closed its channels to British intelligence, citing political sensitivity. In London, the operation was officially suspended, and Cross's final report was stamped, classified, top secret, unresolved. Yet not all threads were lost. In October 1943, the US Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in Bari intercepted a coded, German cable referencing the Petacci archive, transfer imminent. It seemed Mussolini had taken his most private correspondences north into the newly established Italian Social Republic, a puppet regime controlled by the Nazis from Lake Garda. The letters, once hidden beneath the marble floors of the Palazzo Venezia, were now somewhere within the fortified villas of northern Italy. As the front lines shifted and Italy descended into civil war, Cross and her team could only watch from afar. She wrote in her diary, "We chased words written in ink and found they bled through history faster than any bullet." By the end of 1943, Allied intelligence had lost direct contact with their sources inside Mussolini's circle. Rome had fallen to the Germans, and the Vatican retreated into silence. What remained was an empty office in the Palazzo Venezia. Drawers pried open, papers scattered, and a faint scent of cologne clinging to the marble. And somewhere in the Alps, Mussolini himself clutched the black case that had survived his empire, its contents as dangerous as any secret weapon. The Allies would not see those letters again for nearly 2 years. But when they finally resurfaced, the story would take a darker, more tragic turn, one written not in ink, but in blood. The chase for the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle was far from over. April 1945. The Axis dream was in ruins. Hitler's Reich was collapsing from within. The Allies had breached the German heartland, and in northern Italy, Mussolini's last bastion of power, the so-called Italian Social Republic, was unraveling by the day. Yet even in those final desperate hours, one obsession haunted both the Allied and partisan forces advancing through Lombardy, the fate of the Black, case, the container believed to hold Mussolini's most intimate and politically explosive letters. British and American intelligence had reactivated Operation Glass Ink under a new codename, Operation Eclipse. The goal was now recovery, not analysis. The OSS station in Bari, led by Major Peter Tompkins, coordinated with Italian partisans from the Garibaldi brigades to intercept any convoy or aircraft carrying Mussolini north toward the Alps. Reports had surfaced that he was attempting to flee to Switzerland with his Mistress Clara Petacci, accompanied by SS guards and several trunks of personal possessions, including the black leather case that had eluded Allied intelligence for nearly 5 years. The chase began on April 25, 1945. Milan had fallen into chaos as fascist officials scrambled to escape. Eyewitnesses later claimed to have seen Mussolini at the Villa Belmonte, pale and disoriented, clutching papers wrapped in oilcloth. Allied air reconnaissance spotted convoys moving north toward Lake Como. One of them reportedly guarded by the German Waffen-SS unit, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The partisans knew the end was near. "The Duce is running," one radio message read, "and he carries with him the ghosts of all he wrote." As the convoys advanced, so did the British and American hunt. Major Evelyn Cross, now attached to the Allied Psychological Warfare Branch in Rome, was ordered to coordinate intelligence on the ground movement of Italian fascist officials. Her analysis suggested that Mussolini's letters, if captured, could reveal internal betrayals and even expose secret communications with the Vatican and German command. "These papers," she wrote in her report dated April 26th, "are not mere tokens of affection. They are weapons of silence." The climax came 2 days later, near the lakeside village of Dongo. Italian partisans of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, led by Urbano Lazzaro, stopped a German convoy attempting to cross the town. Hidden among the soldiers were several Italians in disguise, including Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci. When they were recognized, chaos erupted. Within hours, the pair were executed by firing squad near the gates of Villa Belmonte. The partisans seized everything Mussolini carried. Among the loot were suitcases filled with uniforms, gold, and documents, and a black leather briefcase bound with metal clasps. Inside were stacks of letters, some singed by fire, others sealed with wax and marked only with initials: CP, GC, and occasionally PB for Pietro Badoglio. Witnesses later described the papers as personal, passionate, and dangerous. But before Allied investigators could reach Dongo, much of the material had vanished. When British and American forces arrived days later, they found fragments of burned correspondence scattered in the villa's courtyard. Sentences half destroyed, signatures erased by smoke. One charred page, preserved by a US officer and later archived in London, read, "If they find these, they will twist love into treason. Burn what you must, but remember me in silence." Another fragment bore the initials C and a date, 1943. The surviving documents were collected by the OSS and handed to British intelligence in Rome under sealed escort. They were immediately classified under the Official Secrets Act, designated Category Omega, reserved for material that could alter post-war political alignments. Historians later learned that the contents included letters between Mussolini and Petacci, describing secret discussions with Hitler, as well as exchanges with members of the fascist Grand Council expressing doubt over Italy's alliance with Germany. Some even suggested that Mussolini had considered negotiating a separate peace as early as 1943, a move that could have changed the course of the war. But the letters also revealed something more human and far more dangerous. They portrayed a man crippled by obsession, dependent on the adoration of those around him, and manipulated by flattery and fear. The love letters that began as whispers of devotion had become instruments of control, emotional chains wielded by those who knew his weaknesses. Allied intelligence concluded that Mussolini's private world had been exploited by both his lovers and his lieutenants to shape political outcomes. When the war ended, the remaining letters were quietly stored in diplomatic archives in London and Washington. Their contents were never released in full. Publicly, officials claimed that the documents contained nothing of consequence. Privately, they feared the repercussions. Italy's fragile post-war government depended on reconciliation, not scandal. Major Cross, having spent 5 years chasing shadows of ink and emotion, was ordered to destroy her remaining field notes. In her final entry, dated August 1945, she wrote, "We found only ashes, perhaps that is all history ever allows. Fragments of truth buried in the smoke of the living. In the years that followed, rumors persisted. Locals near Lake Como claimed that partisan leaders sold some of the letters to journalists, while others were hidden by clerics within the Vatican archives. Occasionally, a scrap or carbon copy surfaced, a signature here, a sentence there, fueling speculation about what secrets Mussolini's final letters truly held. But the central question remained unanswered. Who destroyed the rest? Were the partisans acting on Allied orders? Or did someone ensure that the world would never read what the Duce had written in his final days? The answers, like the ink on those burned pages, were fading fast. And as the world rebuilt itself from the wreckage of war, the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle became not just a story of power, but of silence. The war was over, but its secrets were not. In the summer of 1946, as Italy struggled to define itself in the ashes of fascism, whispers began to surface once more, of letters, of betrayals, and of a love affair that had not only shaken a nation, but haunted the victors. In the archives of Allied command in Rome, a sealed envelope marked Operation Glass Ink Final rested untouched. It contained the remnants of a story that intelligence officers had pursued across continents, through bombings, betrayals, and blood. Now, decades later, historians would come to call it the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle. When the documents were quietly declassified in fragments during the 1950s, they revealed not a simple romance, but a portrait of psychological entanglement. Mussolini's letters to Clara Petacci, the woman who stood beside him to the very end, were filled with contradictions. He wrote of passion and devotion, yet also of doubt, paranoia, and betrayal. "You love the man," one letter read, "but the world sees only the symbol. When the symbol dies, who will love what remains?" It was both confession and prophecy, but beyond the sentiment lay darker threads. Several letters, preserved by the British Foreign Office, hinted at clandestine communications between Mussolini's advisors and both the Vatican and German officials. They detailed power struggles within the fascist hierarchy, moments when loyalty shifted not for ideology, but for survival. Count Galeazzo Ciano's name appeared repeatedly, his correspondence framed by regret and fear. "The Duce believes himself loved," one passage read, "but he is surrounded by mirrors, each reflecting what he wants to see." For the post-war world, such revelations were dangerous. Italy's monarchy was gone, its politics fragile. To publish the full truth risked undermining an already precarious democracy. And so, the letters were locked away once more. Some in British vaults, others in the Vatican's sealed archives. The truth, like the ink that carried it, began to fade from public memory, yet fragments continued to emerge. In 1971, Italian historian Renzo De Felice published excerpts from what he claimed were transcriptions of Mussolini's private papers recovered from Lake Garda. Among them were passages describing meetings with German envoys and references to "a woman who binds me tighter than Berlin ever could." Later studies confirmed the handwriting as Mussolini's, though the original letters remained missing. Others surfaced through the Petacci family, who fought legal battles over personal papers seized by Allied forces in 1945. Each revelation deepened the mystery rather than solved it. For intelligence historians, the letters offered a rare glimpse into the psychological collapse of a dictator. They showed Mussolini as a man torn between affection and ambition, his emotional vulnerabilities exploited by those within his inner circle, military aides, ministers, and lovers alike. In one particularly haunting fragment, written just weeks before his capture, he confessed, "I no longer know who commands, the Duce or the man who still believes in love." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging that power had consumed his humanity. Decades later, newly declassified files from the British National Archives revealed internal memos about the letter's fate. One 1947 document, written by an MI6 officer, stated, "The Mussolini correspondence contains material of both moral and political sensitivity. Recommend indefinite suppression to prevent misuse in Cold War propaganda." The phrase indefinite suppression would remain in effect for over half a century. Even today, much about the letters remains unknown. Some historians believe they were deliberately destroyed to protect Allied and Vatican figures who corresponded with Mussolini during the final years of the war. Others argue they survive, locked within private collections or hidden deep inside church archives. What is certain is that those letters, whether love notes or coded directives, shaped critical moments of wartime decision-making and the fragile diplomacy that followed. For Major Evelyn Cross, whose name appears in the footnotes of several British intelligence histories, the letters were more than an operation. They were an obsession. Her personal diary, discovered after her death in 1963, contained a final reflection. "We searched for truth in ink and found only humanity. His words were his downfall, not for what they said, but for what they revealed of the man beneath the myth." Her words could have served as the epitaph for an entire generation of intelligence officers who had stared into the human soul of war and found it, written in trembling cursive. In the end, the legacy of the secret love letters between Mussolini and his inner circle is not one of romance or scandal, but of revelation. It reminds us that even the most powerful figures in history are prisoners of their own hearts, that behind every command and every speech lies the vulnerability of being human. Today, scholars continue to request access to the remaining sealed files in Rome, London, and the Vatican. Each petition meets the same response: documents unavailable for public release. Whether the truth remains hidden for reasons of diplomacy or dignity is anyone's guess. But somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive drawer or a Vatican vault, the letters still exist. The ink faded, the paper brittle, yet the words untouched, and within those words, the final whispers of a man who tried to command a nation, only to be undone by his own heart.